The transit line at Werk Station, Gate 7, stretched back 42 people by Cale Morrow's count, and it hadn't moved in 11 minutes. He knew this because the wall panel above the processing booths was cycling through a slow readout of local system time, Vthrani Standard, which ran in units of roughly 93 seconds each, and he had counted 6 full cycles while his bag dug its strap into his left shoulder, and the recycled air pushed the same faint chemical smell of floor treatment and industrial sealant across his face for the 100th time. He didn't mind particularly. He had nowhere urgent to be. The connecting freight hop to Outer Reach didn't depart until the following morning, which meant he had an entire evening of transit lounge mediocrity ahead of him, regardless of how quickly this line moved. He shifted the bag to his right shoulder, found a millimeter of comfort in that, and let his gaze drift over the ceiling. Werk Station was old. Not frontier old, not beautiful old, just the particular oldness of infrastructure that had been patched so many times that the patches themselves had been patched. Layers of bureaucratic repair laid down like geological strata. The ceiling arch above Gate 7 was Vthrani original construction, ribbed, slightly iridescent in a way that caught the strip lighting and turned it faintly amber. But the lighting itself was human-sourced. He could tell by the slightly cool temperature of it, the way it sat flat against surfaces instead of diffusing with that warm internal glow Vthrani architecture usually generated. Somewhere in the past 2 decades, a maintenance crew had swapped bulbs. The result was a ceiling that looked like a cathedral and felt like a post office. Cale had spent 6 years traveling transit stations across 4 systems, and Werk was neither the worst nor the best. It was, he had concluded after his second visit, deeply, comprehensively adequate. The coffee at the Level 3 kiosk was better than it had any right to be, given the rest of the establishment, and the observation windows on the north face offered a genuinely fine view of the outer marker buoys on clear atmospheric days. Everything else was transit station. He found transit stations restful in a way that most people did not, but that was a professional adaptation. You spent enough time in them, you stopped seeing them as waiting and started seeing them as a kind of motion, still motion, the pause between 2 different kinds of forward. The line inched forward. He worked freight logistics, not the romantic version, not the armed courier with a ship version, just the ordinary version that meant contracts, waybills, customs declarations, and the particular art of convincing bureaucratic processing systems that the thing he was carrying was exactly what it said on the manifest, and not the other thing that would require 17 forms and a 2-day hold. He was good at this. He had been doing it long enough to understand that the secret was not speed or aggression but patience, and a tone of voice that suggested mild, cooperative boredom. A man with nothing to hide because there was nothing there to find. Transit officers learned quickly which travelers were problems and which were furniture. Cale had spent years perfecting furniture. He did not currently have anything to hide. This was a personal trip, actually. First one in 3 years. A colleague had called it a holiday. Cale had called it a route survey that happened to involve visiting a mountain range he'd always meant to see. The distinction mattered to him in a way he couldn't precisely explain, except that asterisk holiday implied a kind of surrender to purposelessness that didn't sit right, whereas route survey implied that even the aimlessness had a method, which was closer to how he actually operated. The line moved again. He could see the processing booths now. There were 4 of them, standard Vthrani civil transit design, each one a low curved desk behind a polycarbonate shield, the kind of setup that wasn't threatening but wasn't warm either. 3 of the booths were staffed by Vthrani officers in the standard charcoal uniform, the silver piping at shoulder and collar that indicated transit authority rather than military branch. The 4th booth had a small orange out-of-service indicator glowing above it, which explained why the line was moving at the pace of cooling lava. The officer at booth 2 was the one Cale found himself watching as the line compressed forward. Not because she was remarkable from this distance. He couldn't see much from here, just the general shape of a V-Thrani officer behind a screen, but because she was the booth he appeared to be trending toward as the queue naturally divided. He did the small calculation travelers learn to do without thinking. 2 people ahead of him, they would go to booths 1 and 3, he would get booth 2. Fine, booth 2 it was. He had dealt with V-Thrani transit officers perhaps 200 times over the course of his career. The range of temperaments was roughly what you'd expect from any body of officials. Some were brisk and efficient, some were fussy about forms, some had a particular thing about the placement of a thumb on the biometric plate, some were perfectly pleasant if you caught them in a good hour. None of them had ever been memorable in any specific way. He didn't expect booth 2 to be different. He moved up to the yellow approach line, waited while the woman ahead of him processed through booth 3, and then stepped forward at the gesture from the officer at booth 2. He set his bag down, fished out his ID card, and placed it on the reader plate. Sub-Commander Vereth Salemorin was 12 hours into a 14-hour transit shift, and she had processed 407 travelers in that time. She knew it was 407 because the station counting system displayed the number at the bottom right of her work screen, a small piece of data she found simultaneously comforting and depressing. Comforting because it was clear evidence that time was passing. Depressing because 408 to end of shift felt like a distance she couldn't see across. She was not a transit officer by vocation. She had spent 11 years in the V-Thrani Outer Survey Corps, working long-haul deep scan assignments on the station's outer rim, and had come to Gate 7 on what her posting orders cheerfully described as a cross-training rotation, which was the Corps' polite way of saying that budget consolidations had temporarily dissolved her survey unit, and she was being parked somewhere useful while the restructuring worked itself out. The polite way of saying it also implied that she should be grateful for the placement, which she was, technically, in the small and honest part of her that acknowledged she could have been parked somewhere far less congenial. Transit was at least familiar territory. She had cleared transit protocol herself several hundred times in the course of survey work. She understood the logic of it. But she was not, in any meaningful sense, suited to 14-hour checkpoint rotations. Survey work was patience of a different order, the patience of extended distance, of dark and slow, and the long calculation of parallax against the deep rim. It was waiting, but waiting with your hands on something real, something you were gradually understanding. This was waiting while other people did other things, and it asked a different kind of mind. She was not unhappy about it, she was tired. 12 hours of the same intake protocol left a specific kind of residue in the mind, not exhaustion exactly, but a kind of thin transparency, the way a window looks at the end of a long gray day. The world on the other side of it still existed, it just required more effort to bring into focus. She watched the yellow approach line. A man stepped up. Human, she noted this without particular reaction. Verk Station had a human transit population of perhaps 3%. She processed 5 or 6 per shift on average, and they presented no special protocol requirements. The biometric verification ran slightly differently, the parameters adjusted for human physiology, but the workflow was the same. She extended the red tray and waited for his documentation. He placed the card. She was already looking at her secondary screen when the reader ran the scan. She had a minor clearance query running on a V-Thrani cargo agent from 2 booths back. A thread she needed to close before end of shift. Something about a mismatch between a permit date and an invoice timestamp that was almost certainly clerical error, but had to be verified. She glanced at the ID packet loading on her primary screen with the background attention. She'd given the last 407 packets, waiting for the system to flag anything unusual, ready to return to the cargo query if it cleared clean. The packet loaded. The name field populated. Sale read it. She read it again, in the way you sometimes have to read something a second time, not because you didn't understand it the first time, but because the understanding arrived too fast, and the brain wants to verify the translation before accepting it as real. The chair was on wheels. This was, she would think afterward, the central architectural failure of the situation, that the transit authority had chosen to equip the booths with chairs that moved freely across the smooth composite flooring. A fixed chair, or a chair with brakes, or indeed a chair that behaved in any way like a stationary object, would have contained the problem entirely. But transit chairs at Werk Station, Gate 7, were designed for comfort during long shifts, which meant they were lightweight and mobile. And so, when Sub-Commander Vereth Salemoran's entire body locked in a convulsive flinch of disbelief and her weight transferred backward in a sharp, involuntary shift, the chair went with it back, and then sideways, rotating as it went, until it hit the side wall of the booth with a sound like a hollow drum and deposited her in a graceless heap against the paneling. There was a silence. On the other side of the polycarbonate screen, the human man leaned slightly forward, craned his neck to find her, and said, with a tone of complete mild concern, "Are you all right?" She was staring at the ceiling. The ceiling was Vithrani composite, ribbed, very slightly amber in the cool station lighting. She had looked at it before, not from this angle specifically, but close enough. It looked the same from here as from any other angle she'd seen it from over the past 4 months. Uninformative. Sub-Commander, her booth neighbor, Transit Officer Cale Veth, had appeared at the side partition, his expression caught between professional concern and the kind of poorly suppressed alarm that meant he had absolutely witnessed the whole thing and was going to be dining out on it for some time. "I'm fine," Sale said. Her voice came out flat and calm, which was not precisely how she felt, but was the correct sound to produce in this situation. She retrieved the chair with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that how you recovered from a thing was as important as the thing itself. She placed it back in its correct position. She sat down in it. She verified, with the quiet mechanical precision of a survey officer running a post-anomaly check, that her uniform was straight and her screen was still active. The name was still on the screen. She looked at it again. She read it the same way she had read it the first time and the second time, and the result was identical. Morrow, Cale Joran. She looked at the human man on the other side of the screen. He was ordinary. Mid-30s, perhaps, in the way humans aged. It was genuinely difficult to read human age with precision, though she'd gotten considerably better at it during the survey years, when her unit had included 3 human contractors. Brown hair, the slightly sun-worn look of someone who spent time outdoors or on freight decks in recycled UV, a quality of mild weathering that wasn't age but was accumulated exposure. A gray jacket with the kind of worn comfort that said he'd owned it for years, and planned to keep owning it past any reasonable definition of asterisk still serviceable asterisk. A duffel bag at his feet with 2 transit tags and a faded Survey Authority seal. She recognized that seal, Survey Corps issue, civilian contractor type. 2 expeditions minimum to earn that grade of seal. She knew the certifications involved. She looked at the screen again. Morrow Cale Joran, human Terran, civilian transit, freight logistics independent, and below that in the heritage cross-reference field that most travelers either left blank or filled with the most cursory possible family data, Morrow Joran Cale. Survey Corps Outer Rim retired. Werk Station Heritage Archive, Ref. VH 2209. She had not known that field existed in the transit system. It was not something she had occasion to look at in 4 months of transit processing. She was looking at it now. "Is there a problem?" the man Cale Morrow said. His voice was unhurried. Not nervous, not defensive, not the voice of someone with something to hide or something to prove. Just the steady patience of someone accustomed to waiting at checkpoints, who had learned through repetition that the waiting was part of the process, and the process was worth respecting. No, Sale said, and then because that was not precisely accurate, a moment. She opened the Heritage Archive query. She had access to it as a Corps officer, though she had rarely used it in transit processing. It was primarily a research tool, something survey historians and family researchers pulled for academic or genealogical work. She entered the reference number from the cross-reference field. The archive record loaded. She read it. She read it again. She placed her hands very carefully flat on the desk and kept them there. Cale had been in transit lines long enough to develop a reliable internal diagnostic for trouble. Not dramatic trouble, not the kind that involved armed officers appearing from side doors and a very long next conversation, but the small, procedural trouble that meant something in his documentation had snagged on a system flag, or a payment authorization had failed to propagate across jurisdictions, or someone at a desk had gone down a search path that was technically his problem to wait out. The officer at Booth 2 was going down a path that was taking a while. She was also, and this was less standard, very clearly in the grip of something she hadn't been in the grip of 30 seconds ago. The chair incident had been startling from his side of the screen. He'd heard the crash before he processed what had caused it, and his first instinct had been medical. Blood pressure event, vestibular issue, something that required him to call for assistance. But she'd gotten up with a speed and composure that told him whatever had happened, it wasn't her body. It was her brain encountering something unexpected. He ran through the standard inventory. Documentation clean, it always was. He was religious about it, not from anxiety but from professional pride. Freight license current. No goods being transported. Personal trip. No outstanding flags from any transit system he'd passed through in the past 2 years. Personal history. Boring in precisely the way transit officers appreciated. What the officer at Booth 2 was doing now was not standard review. She had opened something on a secondary panel, the archive query interface, from what little he could see of the panel's edge, and she was reading it with the stillness of a person who had temporarily forgotten she was being watched. It was a particular kind of reading, the kind where the information was arriving faster than the response could form. She looked up. Her eyes were the pale silver gray that he associated with outer Survey Corps officers, not a universal Vethrani characteristic, but a notably common one among the long-haul deep-scan personnel, something about sensory adaptation to extended exposure to low-light environments. He'd worked with 4 Survey Corps contractors over the years, and they all had that quality. Eyes slightly too still, slightly too focused, the look of someone who had spent years learning to see very faint things at very great distances and had developed, in doing so, a way of looking that didn't waste itself on intermediate space. "Your father," she said, "Joran Morrow." Cale blinked. In 6 years of transit checkpoints, no one had ever led with his father's name. Yes. He served on the outer rim. He did. He kept his voice even not because he was guarded, but because he genuinely didn't know yet what this was. Civilian survey contractor. About 30 years ago, give or take. He retired before I was born, actually, before I was conceived, technically. He was back on Earth by the time I came along. The officer was looking at him with an expression that was doing several things at once, and he couldn't separate them from this distance. Not hostility, not suspicion, something more complicated than either. "Is there something in my file," he said carefully, "that I should know about?" "No," she paused. "There is something I should know about apparently, and I did not." Another pause, briefer. "I apologize for the delay." She returned to the primary screen. He watched her process the documentation, biometric confirmation, transit clearance, manifest review, with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done it 400 times today. She was doing it correctly. He could track the sequence in the way the panel responded. But her eyes kept moving, very slightly, back to the secondary panel. Whatever she had read, she hadn't finished processing it. "Mr. Morrow," she slid his card back through the return tray. "Your transit is cleared. Gate 7 connecting hub, follow the yellow line." "Thank you," he said, picking up the card. He reached for his bag, stopped, and straightened. "Excuse me. I know this is an unusual question for a transit checkpoint, but is everything all right?" She looked at him. It was, he thought, a very particular kind of look. Not "what a strange question" and not "please proceed through the gate." It was the look of a person who had just done a calculation and come out somewhere they hadn't expected, and was still standing in the new location figuring out the geography. "You are traveling to the connecting hub for outer reach," she said. "Tomorrow morning, I have the evening. There is a core memorial archive on level 4 of the transit terminal," she said, with the careful precision of someone relaying coordinates. "It is maintained by the Survey Heritage Division. Most travelers do not know it exists." A pause. "If you have time before your departure, it may be of interest to you." He studied her. She was not a person who chose words carelessly. That much was clear from a 4-minute conversation. "Why?" She looked back at her screen and then briefly at him. "Because your father is in it." He found the archive between a shuttered refreshment kiosk and a service access panel on the west corridor of level 4, an arched doorway with a small bronze-toned plaque reading Vithrani Outer Survey Corps, Heritage Archive, Verk Station Annex. The door was unlocked. The room beyond was the size of a generous office, cool and dim. The walls lined with storage plaques and display panels in a design aesthetic that was 20 years behind current construction. Consistent with the Survey Corps funding trajectory he was vaguely aware of. The long, slow decline of institutional commitment to DPRIM work, as the more accessible systems returned more immediately profitable results. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room. Then he went in. The archive was organized chronologically along the left wall. He followed it to the section covering the years his father would have been active on the outer rim. A 6-year window, roughly, in the period when Joran Morrow had been contracted to the deep scan teams operating along the Verk outer marker system. Cale had heard some of these stories, or partial versions of them. His father had not been a demonstrative man. He talked about the survey work with the plain, satisfied affect of someone describing a job they'd found genuinely interesting without feeling the need to make that interestingness into an argument. He answered questions honestly and thoroughly when asked. He simply didn't volunteer the most dramatic parts of things. "The stars out there are different," he'd said once, when Cale was about 7 and had asked what it was like. "The light takes so long to get here that by the time you see a star, you've already seen it as it was, not as it is. Everything you're looking at is history." Cale had found this either very philosophical or very sad, and had been unable to decide which for about 3 years, at which point he'd concluded it was probably both, and that was all right. The plaque he found his father on was third from the right in the third row, a section labeled * long-haul civilian contractors, survey cycle 14. There was a photograph, a Vithrani rendering system output, slightly formal, the kind taken at the beginning of a posting. His father, younger than Cale had ever known him, 32 or 33, the same brown hair and the same quality of unperformed calm. And below it a short record summary. Morrow Joran Cale, Human Terran. Civilian Deep Scan Specialist, Cycle 14, Years 1-6. Assigned, Deep Rim Survey Unit 7. Notable actions, documented in Unit Incident Record VR7229, Sale Incident, Year 3. Survey Heritage Archive Citation for Extraordinary Civilian Service. He had never heard of any of this. Not the citation, not the incident record, not any of it. He looked around the room for a display terminal, found one in the far corner, settled into the chair in front of it, and pulled up archive reference VR7229. It loaded slowly. The terminal was older than the plaque system, running on a V-Thrani OS that had probably been state-of-the-art in survey circles some years back, and was now running on institutional inertia. A text record loaded first, supplemented by a scan photograph, which resolved through the system's lag with the patience of a thing that had been waiting 30 years and wasn't in a hurry. He read. He read it slowly, because it was the kind of thing that required the reading to happen properly. He read it twice. He looked at the scanned photograph, his father in a survey vest beside what appeared to be the field-patched drive housing of a small survey skiff, the exterior of the vessel showing the scratches and atmospheric trace scorch of deprim operation, and he sat with it for a while, in the archive room in the quiet. He understood now why the officer at Booth 2 had fallen out of her chair. The door opened while he was still sitting with it. He heard it and glanced up, and saw the transit officer from Booth 2 standing in the doorway. She had removed the charcoal duty jacket. She wore the inner layer, the gray-fitted base that was core issue rather than transit authority, the distinction visible in the cut and the insignia. And she was carrying 2 small cups from what he assumed was the refreshment kiosk down the corridor, since she held them with the slight careful grip of someone transporting something hot. She crossed the room and extended one toward him with the formal deliberateness of a person who had made a decision, and was now enacting it exactly as planned. "I thought you might appreciate something to drink," she said. He looked at the cup, then at her. "You're off duty." "My shift ended 12 minutes ago." "You knew I'd be here." "I thought it was likely." She set the cup on the edge of the display terminal in a space that had clearly been cleared for precisely this placement. "I am Subcommander Vereth Sale Morin," she said. "Survey Corps Outer Rim, retired from active survey, currently on cross-training rotation at Gate 7, transit processing." A brief pause of the kind that carries weight. The Sale incident. He looked at her. "That's your family name," he said. "In the record." "The officer who was recovered," she said, and her voice was precise and even in the way of someone who had said this thing before, in private, and was saying it now in front of someone else for the first time, "was my mother." She sat down in one of the archive chairs. There were 2, low-slung and slightly worn, the seating of a room that was technically public but rarely visited, and he took the other, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything. The archive room had a particular quality of silence that Cale associated with places that held records, not oppressive, not reverent, just full. The kind of silence that had things in it. Sale Morin, Sale, his mind had already settled on, held her cup in both hands and looked at the wall panel. He did the same, and did not fill the silence with unnecessary words, because the silence was, he thought, appropriate. "I was 3 years old," she said finally, "when it happened." "You wouldn't remember it." "No, I only know it from the record, and from what my mother told me when I was old enough for it to mean something." She turned the cup slowly in her hands, a small meditative motion, as if the warmth helped her think. She said she had been sitting in the dark for 6 hours counting down the atmosphere gauge when the hatch opened. She didn't know if it would be a rescue team or if she had finally begun to hallucinate from oxygen reduction. "And then the hatch opened and there was your father, and he looked," she said he looked like a man who had dropped by to borrow a tool. Completely unhurried. She said she told him she was running low on air, and he said he knew, and that she should sit tight while he had a look at the drive. Cale found he was smiling, slightly and involuntarily. It was, in a way he couldn't have put into a formula, entirely recognizable. Not as a story he'd heard, he hadn't heard this story, but as a behavior pattern. His father responding to a crisis with the same affect he brought to fixing the perimeter generator on a winter morning. "Sit tight. I'll have a look." She never met him again, Sale continued. She was transferred during his remaining rotation cycle. She filed the citation, he received it through the standard mail system, and then the years happened. She retired eventually. She speaks of him still sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. She has a particular name for him in Vithrani, which is, it does not translate precisely. Kale Doreth Mal, approximately, the one who came through the cold. The archive room was very quiet. She's still living? He asked. Yes, she retired 8 years ago. She lives at the Northern Observatory Holding, near the ridge system on Verk's outer shore. She does horizon observation work for the Corps Reserve on a volunteer basis, but mostly she tends the garden. A very slight pause. She has never stopped thinking about him. I should tell you that plainly. I'll tell you something equally plainly, Kale said. I never knew any of this existed. Sale looked at him with those survey-trained eyes, focused and still, reading something at distance. Nothing. He talked about the survey work. He talked about the stars, the outer rim, the way the light was different that far out. He described the technical work in some detail when I was old enough to understand it. He never mentioned a rescue. Not once, not in any form I recognized. He looked at the photograph on the display, his father young and unhurried beside the patched skiff. That is also, as you said, entirely consistent. My mother said, Sale said slowly, that she asked him why he'd come. After, once the situation was stabilized, on the return to station range. She asked him why he'd gone outside the response perimeter in a civilian vessel against a formal advisory, and he told her he'd done the calculation. What calculation? She asked him the same question. He said the calculation was simple. If he went and it worked, she was alive. If he went and it didn't work, he'd tried. If he didn't go, she was certainly dead. A pause. She said it was the most logical and the most human thing she had ever heard anyone say at the same time. Kale was quiet for a moment. That was his way, he said. He thought everything was a calculation. Not coldly, he wasn't cold. But he believed that most situations had a structure, and if you found the structure, you could find the answer. He used to say, most problems look like chaos from the outside and look like arithmetic from the inside. The trick is getting inside. Sale turned her cup again. What work did he do after survey? He went back to Earth for a few years. That's where I was born, where I grew up. He did some consulting work, some academic reviewing of deep scan data for research teams. When I was about 12, he went back to the outer systems for a second contractor posting, shorter, 2 years. He was back by the time I was 15. He paused. He died 4 years ago, quietly as he did most things. I'm sorry, she said, and it was not the reflexive courtesy form, it was direct and real. Thank you, he picked up his cup. The warmth of it was a simple and genuine comfort. Tell me about your mother. The garden, is it the kind of garden she built, or the kind that was already there? The question surprised her slightly. He saw it in the fractional shift of her expression, the recalibration. Then she settled. She built it. Over 20 years of observation postings, she collected seeds and cuttings from everywhere she surveyed. The Northern Holding was an observatory outpost originally, bare rock gardens, survey functional, and she spent the first 5 years of her retirement turning it into something else. Now it grows things that have no business growing in the same soil together, from 6 different system types, because she persuaded them somehow. A pause. She has a very specific relationship with plants. She talks to them. Does it work? The garden is remarkable, so I assume so. The slight smile again, restrained and genuine. She would find it embarrassing to be told that directly. He talked about his father for 2 hours, and didn't notice the time passing until he looked at the station clock on the archive room wall, and calculated that the refreshment kiosk in the corridor was certainly closed by now. He was not generally a person who talked at length about personal things. His profession had shaped him toward efficiency, the freight manifest as model for communication, clear, complete, correct, and no more elaborate than the shipment required. But the archive room was quiet, and she listened in a specific way he noticed without being able to immediately name. Not performatively, not the active listening theater that some people deployed when they wanted you to feel heard, just genuinely attentive. The way the Survey Corps trained you to be attentive to faint signals in the deep rim. You were quiet because noise contaminated the data, and you were patient because the signal arrived at its own pace. He told her about his father's hands, which had been calloused in a specific cross pattern from survey equipment handles that he hadn't seen on anyone else's hands. The workshop off the kitchen that had permanently absorbed the smell of technical lubricant to the point where the smell was the workshop, essentially. You smelled it in the doorway before you were fully through. The precise way his father had explained stellar distance to a 7-year-old. Not in numbers but in the metaphors of light, the idea that you were always looking at a star's history rather than its present, that the sky was a vast and beautiful record of things already past. He told her about being 17 and announcing he wanted to go into freight logistics, which was adjacent to survey work without being survey work, moving things across the same distances, by different means and different purpose. His father had said that's a good field with the tone of a man who meant it, and then spent an evening explaining the one thing he considered essential. The manifest matters, his father had said, with the quiet emphasis he reserved for things he actually believed. What you're carrying matters. You take care of it because it's not yours, because someone's waiting for it and they trusted you with it. The trust is the whole transaction. He told her about the second contractor posting when he was 12, how his father had come back from it with a particular way of looking at the sky on Earth that hadn't been there before, a stillness when he stood outside at night, as if he was measuring the distance to things. Sale asked 2 questions over the course of this. The first, he had tools that he cleaned. Her mother had mentioned this, apparently, with a specificity that meant it had struck her. Cale confirmed it. His father cleaned tools as a practice, not as maintenance. The cleaning was part of the work. You did it before and after. He didn't know where his father had gotten this idea but had inherited it himself, more or less. The second question, had Cale met other survey veterans in his career? He said yes, a few. The skills translated to freight in certain ways, the patience, the structural thinking, the calm in the face of logistical anomaly. Most of them had the same quality, the one his father had had. The calm. He'd wondered sometimes if the survey trained it into you or if the survey selected for it in the first place. Both, Sale said, with the certainty of personal data. The work selects for a certain temperament and then reinforces it. You cannot panic at depth. There is nothing to receive it. A pause. I miss active survey more than I had expected. The checkpoint work is correct and useful. But the distances are very short, and I keep finding myself reading outer horizon reports in the evenings and thinking about parallax calculations. Is the rotation meant to find you a rhythm while the core restructures? Something like that. 6 months nominally, it has been 4. I receive the restructuring updates and they are always proceeding. She turned her empty cup. I have begun to suspect that proceeding is a permanent state. He considered. My father used to say about being stationed somewhere that wasn't where he expected to be, which happened in survey with some frequency, that the location was never the point. The observation work was the point. And you could do observation work anywhere, if you were paying the right kind of attention. Sale looked at him steadily. That is either wisdom or rationalization. He would have said both, probably. He thought the categories were not always usefully distinct. And you? I work freight logistics, he said. My professional framework is, does it get where it's going in the condition it needs to arrive in? Most of the philosophy works out from there. She was quiet for a moment. The archive room had shifted as they'd talked, the ambient lighting cycling through its simulated day, warming now toward the amber of station evening, and the room had taken on a quality he associated with late evening spaces, the particular ease of a place that has stopped performing and is simply being. He became aware, somewhere in the middle of his own story, that he was more comfortable in this room with this woman he had met 90 minutes ago than he was in most places he spent his time. He wasn't sure what to do with this observation. He filed it professionally under asterisk data point, significance unclear, revisit. He had a particular way of reframing things, Sale said. Yes, you have something of it. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a few seconds, which was a specific kind of silence, not empty, not awkward, just a pause in which things were present that had not been said. They left the archive room together at the station's 9th hour, when the level 4 corridor had gone quiet, and the refreshment kiosk was shuttered, and the maintenance lighting ran in its clean amber lines along the floor edges. The quiet at this hour in a transit station was one of Cale's preferred states of being. He'd always thought of it as the real character of a station, the thing underneath the processing end moving that emerged when the movement paused. She walked with him to the lift bank. You said your mother gardens, he said, at the Northern Observatory holding. Yes. Does she take visitors? Sale stopped walking. He stopped too, a half step ahead, and turned. The outer reach route, he said. The one I'm catching tomorrow morning. It runs a secondary leg through the Werk Northern Station. I've taken it before. There's a 4-hour layover at the Northern Junction. She was looking at him with the survey focus, that quality of reading something at distance, patiently, all the way through. That is not why you are going to outer reach, she said. No, it's a route survey, personal. I had a mountain range I'd been meaning to see for years. But you would stop at the Northern Station. If there were a reason to. She was quiet. The lift bank was 10 meters away. Neither of them moved toward it. Through the level 4 observation strip, a long, narrow window set into the outer wall at standing height, the Werk outer stars spread in their faint, patient light. He had looked at these stars from this station before, on previous transits. They looked the same tonight as they had then, which was to say, ancient, various, and in the process of being seen as they had already been rather than as they currently were. My mother, Sale said more slowly, would find this remarkable. Joran Morrow's son in the Gate 7 transit line 30 years after the Sale incident. She has the archive citation plaque on the shelf above her garden window. She has had it there since her first year in the holding. A pause. She would consider it a meaningful thing. I can tell you that without any uncertainty. And you? She looked at him with the expression that he still couldn't fully read, the calculation that had come out somewhere unexpected, and the person running it still working through what the result meant. I fell out of my chair, she said. It came out with the perfect, straight-faced delivery of a person who had decided to acknowledge the undeniable with full composure, and Cale laughed, a real one, genuinely startled out of him. And she smiled then, finally, a real one, the kind that arrived slowly and settled like it intended to stay. It transformed her face in a specific way, made it less survey and more present. I think, he said, that probably counts as a meaningful thing. Professionally, she said, and her tone was only partially dignified. It was not a highlight of the rotation. To be fair, I've had worse moments in transit processing. I would be curious to know how. I once filed a cargo manifest under the wrong species designation and spent 45 minutes explaining to a Vithrani port officer why I was importing 300 kilograms of what the system had classified as personal biological material, which was actually dried legumes. She was quiet for a half-second. Then, what were the legumes for? A catering contract. Frontier Station Harvest Celebration. And how did the port officer receive this explanation? With the expression of a person who has heard many explanations in her career and is deciding which category this one belongs to. What category did she choose? Extremely boring, he said. Which is the correct category? She cleared it in about 90 seconds. The smile had become, he thought, a fixed feature of her face in this moment, which was different from the compressed professionalism of Booth 2. It was a good smile, the kind that was earned rather than deployed. The northern station, she said. The layover. Yes. I could. My mother's communication schedule is predictable. She reads station traffic in the early morning and responds at the midday hour. She paused in the way of someone choosing coordinates. I could send word ahead if you wished, that you were coming, that you were who you are. He considered it. It was a real consideration, not a formality, what it would mean to the woman on the other side of it, the one who had the plaque on her shelf above the garden window. What it would mean to stand in front of her. His father's name, his father's face rebuilt imprecisely from his own, the continuation of a thing that had ended 30 years ago without resolution or closure, just the clean, ordinary arithmetic of, she's alive because he went, and then the years happened. I would like that, he said. She nodded once, with the small formal precision of a confirmed coordinate. Then, my personal contact address is on the core network under the Outer Rim roster. It is not difficult to find, but it requires knowing to look for it. Now that I know to look, he said, I'll find it. She looked at him for one more moment, with the look that was still running its calculation somewhere behind her eyes, the look of someone who had started the day at a transit checkpoint expecting the same 400 entries as every other day, and had ended it somewhere she hadn't mapped in advance. Safe transit, Cale Morrow, she said. Safe passage, Subcommander. She turned and walked back toward the Level 4 access corridor, her footsteps quiet on the composite floor. He watched her go the way you watch something you have just understood, attentive to it, and to the changed quality of the space it leaves behind. He messaged her from the connecting hub departure lounge at the 6th hour the following morning, while the freight hop was loading, and the lounge filled with the particular bleary silence of early departures, people who were in transit before they were fully awake, carrying coffee in the careful two-handed grip of the not yet conscious. He gave the message some thought first. He was not a person who sent messages without thinking about what they were actually saying and whether that was the thing he meant to say. The message he settled on was short. I found the core network roster. Northern Station layover is confirmed at 14:00. I thought you should know the route if you happen to be talking to your mother. The response came 11 minutes later, faster than the Survey Corps response threshold, for a message she'd had no particular reason to be watching for. I have already spoken to her. She will expect you at the holding gate at the 15:00 hour. She said, and I am reporting this verbatim because I think you should hear it exactly as she said it. Tell me what he looks like. I told her. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, Good, that's a good face. Your father had a face like that. He read this twice slowly. Below it in Sale's own voice, with no additional framing. She is not wrong for what it is worth. Safe travels. He looked at it for a long time in the departure lounge, with the freight hop loading behind him and the lounge lights running their flat morning efficiency and the other passengers wrapped in their pre-departure quiet. Then he looked out the observation window at the outer Werk stars, the ones his father had once described not as they were, but as they had been light that had been traveling toward this precise moment for longer than either of them had lived. He wrote back, Tell her I'll bring coffee, human roasted if I can source it at the Northern Station Junction. My father used to say it was the most reliable currency in any system. The response was almost immediate, which he noted. She laughed, she said, Yes. That sounds exactly right. The Northern Observatory holding sat into the ridge face like something that had decided to be there rather than been built. Low-walled, stone-colored, the kind of structure that accumulated rightness through decades of small decisions made by someone who cared about the specific ground it occupied. The garden ran along the southern face in terrace levels, and he could see from the holding gate that it was exactly what Sale had described. Organized wildness, the kind of garden that had found the point past which tidiness was the enemy of growth, and had released everything on the correct side of that line. Edith Sale-Morin was waiting at the gate. She was older than the archive photograph. The photograph was 30 years old. Of course it was, but the survey years sat on her the way they sat on her daughter, the same quality of focused stillness, the same economy of movement. She had silver hair and the pale gray eyes, and she was watching him cross the last 10 meters of path with an expression he recognized, after a moment's thought, as the expression of a person who has been told something and is now verifying whether the account was accurate. She looked at him for a long moment. "You have his hands," she said, "the same build of them." He looked down at his own hands, which was a reflex he recognized as slightly absurd and also genuine. "I've been told I have his way of standing," he said. "I never quite knew what that meant. I can tell you if you like." She reached through the gate bars and unexpectedly, with the direct simplicity of someone to whom formality had become optional, took his hand briefly in both of hers. Not a greeting exactly, more of a verification. Then she released it and stepped back to open the gate. "Come in. I made tea, but I understand you've brought something better." He produced the coffee he'd found human roasted at the Northern Junction kiosk, the good kind, not the processed version, and she received it with the careful attention of someone who understood what a thing represented as well as what it was. "Your father," she said, leading him into the garden, "used to bring coffee to every long-haul unit briefing. We were all Vithrani except him. None of us drank it. He drank it alone every morning and didn't make a point of it. By the end of the first year, 2 people in the unit had started drinking it with him, and by the end of the second year, it was half the unit, and by the end of the third year, the core supply line was including it in the standard unit order, and no one could precisely remember how that had happened." He smiled. "That is an extremely recognizable story." He was very good at that, the thing you didn't notice happening until it had already happened. She stopped at a garden bench set into a stone alcove, with a view down the terrace levels to the lower garden beds, and beyond them the blue-gray line of the outer sea. "Sit down. Tell me about him." "I have been waiting 30 years for someone who could tell me about him in the present tense, and I understand I am now going to have to settle for past tense, which is its own kind of loss. But I'll take it." He sat down, and he told her about his father. He told her things he had told Sale in the archive room, and things he hadn't gotten to the second contractor posting. The specific way his father had come back from it changed in a subtle and permanent way, the quality of someone who had put something down and picked something else up and was still finding the new weight of it. The way he'd said once, when Cale was about 20 and asking whether he missed the survey work, "I miss the distances. Everything here is so close together. But I don't miss the cold." He hadn't explained that at the time. Cale thought he understood it better now. Edith listened without interruption. She had her coffee held in both hands and her face turned slightly toward the outer sea, the way a person who has done long-range observation all their life keeps an orientation toward distance. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. "He was a good man," she said simply. "I have known a great many good people in a long career, and some of them were remarkable in various ways, and some were not. He was both. He was remarkable in the way that good people sometimes are when they simply will not argue with arithmetic." She turned to look at him. "I spent a long time being grateful to him, and then a long time being sad that I couldn't tell him so directly, and then I made my peace with the fact that some debts stay open. You keep the record. The debt doesn't disappear, it just waits." "He would have considered the debt paid," Cale said. "Surplus, even. He didn't keep debts in either direction." "No," she said, "that is also consistent." A pause. "Your sister Sale, she sent me a message last night after she spoke to you at the transit station. She said you had his way of staying in a room." "What does that mean?" "It means you didn't leave in a hurry," Edith said. "She said you stayed until the room had finished saying what it had to say. Most people don't do that. Most people hurry past." She looked at the garden. "He did that. He stayed in the rooms until they were done." "Your sister. He turned the word over privately. It was the Vithrani familial shorthand. She had used it easily, not metaphorically, the way you'd use it for a person who was not precisely family but occupied a function adjacent to it. He didn't correct it. He spent 2 hours at the holding before the layover window required him to return to the junction for the outer reach departure. When he left, she pressed a cutting of something into his hand, small, wrapped in damp paper, a green thing with narrow leaves and a faint sharp smell. "For wherever you're keeping yourself," she said, "it grows anywhere." Joran once asked me where this species came from, and I told him it was from a survey world I'd scanned in Cycle 9, no official name, just a catalog number. He thought about it and then said, "You should name it," so I did. It's in the core botanical record as *Morrow's Ridge Runner. She smiled, briefly and without performance. He didn't know I'd named it after him. I filed the paperwork after the transfer. It seemed like the correct use of naming rights. Cale looked at the cutting in his hand. The small green thing named after his father by a woman who had owed him 30 years of gratitude and had found the only form she could put it in. "I'll keep it," he said. "I know you will," she said. She walked him to the gate. At the last moment he turned back. "The plant," he said. "The name in the botanical record, Morrow's Ridge Runner, he never knew." "No, I filed the record the week after his transfer completed. It was the only form I could find for what I wanted to say." She looked at him steadily. "The record is public. Survey Heritage has it. He could have found it if he'd ever looked." He thought about this. His father, who had kept the citation plaque somewhere, he hadn't known where, hadn't known the plaque existed, would now have to go back through the things that had been boxed after the quiet death and find it. His father, who believed that most problems had a structure, and most structures had an answer, and most answers were smaller and more arithmetic than they appeared from the outside. His father, who had gone out into the cold and brought someone home, and then put it in the past and gotten on with things, and never thought to mention it. "He would have been glad to know," Cale said, "that you named it. He would have been very understated about it, but he would have been glad." "Yes," she said, "I expect so." A pause. "I am glad you came." "Safe passage, Evith Sale Morin," he said. "Come back," she said. It was not a question. "I will," he said. 3 weeks later, a message arrived at his freight terminal with a Werk Station Core network origin code, not the transit authority system, the core personal registry. He had, as promised, found the address. Route survey complete. He was alone in the freight office, late in the station evening, with a cup of the Northern Junction coffee he'd brought back 2 bags of, and a small green plant on the windowsill that was visibly, almost assertively, thriving in a freight logistics office environment as if it had no concept of being out of place. He looked at the message for a moment and then smiled. "Ongoing, long duration. I'm told the best surveys take time." The response arrived in 6 minutes. "I have submitted my return request to the Survey Corps Outer Rim Division. My cross-training rotation ends in 7 weeks. The Outer Rim, as it turns out, has not moved. If you happen to pass through Werk Station before then, Gate 7 is staffed until the 19th hour. I will be at Booth 2. I will endeavor to remain in my chair." He laughed, alone in his office, the kind of laugh that was genuinely surprised out of him, the kind that arrives from somewhere you didn't expect and leaves the room feeling less empty when it's gone. He looked at the plant on the windowsill, the one named after his father by the woman who owed him 30 years of a debt that had never closed, who had met his son at a transit gate purely by the operation of a cross-reference field that most travelers left blank. His father had believed that most situations had a structure, and if you found the structure, you could find the answer. He had believed that the manifest mattered, that what you carried mattered, because someone was waiting for it, and the trust was the whole transaction. He wrote back 1 word. "Noted." And then, after a moment, 2 more. "I will." He looked at the plant, and then at the distant outer stars visible through the freight office's small high window, the ones that were already history by the time the light arrived. He thought his father would have considered this a very good day's work. He thought it might be the beginning of an even better one.